A part of our Bel Pres vision is to equip our congregation to be fully engaged disciples. And we believe that disciples have 6 characteristics. One of those characteristics is to be a healer of injustice. There are many issues of racial injustice happening in our world and in our region. And if we try to tackle them all at once, it can feel very overwhelming. And so we found that we needed to focus on one issue of racial justice at a time. So the question came up, in our Seattle East Side context, which injustice needs to be healed? And for the past 9 years that we have had a justice and racial reconciliation team here at Bel Pres, there has been a consistent answer to that question. And that has been the historic injustice of redlining and racially restrictive covenants. These 2 historic practices are at the root of many of the issues we are seeing today, from the affordable housing crisis to public education inequities, a racial wealth gap, and more. It doesn't have to be this way. There are things that we can do to help heal this injustice as we follow Jesus on a journey to discover what it truly means to love our neighbors as ourselves. But first, there's much to learn, there's much to pray about, and there's much to do. We have an opportunity to show our community what it looks like when Christians respond to hard things. To help us better grasp this concept, I would like to introduce Dave and Julie Metz, longtime Bel Pres members, who will teach us more about this historic injustice and why it matters for us today.
What does the history of land have to do with loving our neighbor? Quite a lot, actually.
Owning a home is one of the primary ways American families build wealth.
For a long time, people who are not white, particularly African Americans, were not allowed to buy homes in certain parts of town simply because of the color of their skin.
Beginning in the 1930s and throughout World War II, the federal government created programs to encourage home ownership by insuring mortgages. Government agencies created maps of every city in the nation to evaluate the risk of loaning money to buy a home.
The neighborhoods considered financially safe were colored green. Those more risky were colored red. This practice is known as redlining.
Neighborhoods automatically earned a red rating, aka most risky, if African Americans simply lived in them or near them. This was true even in middle-class neighborhoods that were made up of predominantly single-family homes that would have otherwise been more valuable if white families had lived there. Consequently, the FHA would not provide insurance or mortgages to people in these areas, and private lenders began to use these maps to deny financial services to individuals in redlined areas.
Also during this time, communities in Bellevue, Seattle, and across the country, people were using racially restrictive covenants to enforce segregation. Property deeds contain agreements between the buyers and the sellers. These are called covenants. Some covenants included language that excluded certain races or ethnicities from purchasing or living on property. For example, this property shall not be resold, leased, rented, or occupied except to or by persons of the Aryan race. Although these covenants are no longer enforceable, the language remains on over 30,000 properties in King County. Their existence is antithetical to the kingdom of God.
The effects of this systemic discrimination are still visible today. One of the ways that we see this is in home ownership. In the state of Washington currently, white families are twice as likely to own a home as African American families. This is largely why in this state, the household wealth of white families is 10 times that of African American families.
Another impact is on public schools, which are mainly funded by property taxes. Schools in historically redlined areas have a much smaller pool of money to draw from than the wealthy white suburbs. This is due to people owning less valuable homes. This means there is less school funding, less experienced teachers, lower test scores, and lower graduation rates.
Bel Pres, Jesus calls us to be healers of injustice. Together, as we listen to and learn from our neighbors and community, we are called to care, rewrite, and heal injustice for the kingdom.